Do you sometimes wonder how you could truly have an impact when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? How do you know you are moving in the right direction when it comes to becoming a more inclusive individual? As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod brings topics such as ethnicity, genders, sexuality, or religion on the table. We talk about research and science, but also emotions, feelings, and vulnerability. We discuss allyship, advocacy, and privilege. But most importantly, we talk action. Because without action, we stay still. And when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, stillness is never the answer. Welcome to As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod.
Today's episode is all about biases, possibly the basis of any work about becoming more self-aware and starting our journey to become more inclusive individuals. I have had the pleasure to talk to Matthew Cahill, who is the CEO and president of the Percipio company. His deep expertise in cognitive, social, and workplace biases is rooted in the belief that if you have a brain, you have bias. He helps executives reduce mental mistakes, strengthen workplace relationships, and disrupt existing bias within current HR processes, meeting protocols, and corporate policies. Matthew has demonstrated success with large clients like LinkedIn, Salesforce, and dozens of small to mid-sized companies looking to create more inclusive workplaces, work smarter, generate more revenue, and move from bias to belonging. Welcome to episode 12 of As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod.
Welcome to this episode of As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod. Matthew, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Julian. Thank you for having me on Two Peas in a Pod. I love that name.
I think, it took me a little bit of time to come up with the name, and I think it was the idea that in principle we all similar. We should be all the same. That's at least what we want to aim for. But in reality, we're as diverse as these two peas in a pod, indeed.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll unpack this a little bit farther. But the surface of those peas are social constructs. So the colors of our skin have been used for social constructs in very nefarious ways. But I don't want to jump right into that yet.
Well, let's start then and jump right in the discussion, but to get to know you a little bit more. So Matthew, what's your story?
My story. Currently I'm in San Francisco, California. I've often joked that San Francisco, beneath the city itself, deep within the earth, there's a magnet that's attracting the weirdos and freaks from all over the planet. Like, people come to San Francisco for eccentricity, for diversity, for all sorts of different ideas. And then, sometimes they stay, sometimes they come into the city, and this is for all walks of life, all orientations. They meet, they migrate, they mate, and they migrate. And they leave the city for something that's more similar, for that sameness, for that sense of comfort. And I like to say my wife and I have bucked that trend. We stayed here in San Francisco. We have 2 children. We're living and working in San Francisco and making the most of it.
Amazing. Well, that's then, based on that description, there's definitely a place I need to come and visit soon then.
Oh my gosh, it is. I'm very biased to say it is the most beautiful city on the planet. There's maybe some that are close, that were in the same top 5. Let's just be I'll be a less biased if I say it.
And you're talking to someone who comes from Paris, so that's going to be a difficult one to sell as well, possibly.
Ah, yes, yes, yes,
But
yes.
I'll definitely come and check it out and make up my mind for sure.
You have a place to stay. You're welcome to come. I'd love to make that happen.
Brilliant. Well, you started talking about biases, which is kind of what we're going to really dig into today, because that's the heart of your work, I believe. And yeah, I think I want to start with a very simple question, actually, that is probably the base of everything. How would you define what biases are?
That's a great question to start with. It is the foundational question that I use with all of my engagements, is to get clarity on what that means.
Mm-hmm.
Because bias, it's one of those slippery terms, one of those terms that it's very contextual and means something different depending on the context.
Mm-hmm.
So I think at its very, very, very essence, bias is it's a preference. It's an unconscious motivator, a way for our brains, right? If we're talking about cognitive biases.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where I think it's important to distinguish, because if you're talking about cognitive biases, then there are these both stated and unstated preferences that come into play. And the field of research on cognitive biases has just exploded. There's well over 200 different named cognitive biases that are mostly outside of our conscious awareness, right? The preference definition plays into, conscious biases. Like you, Julian, you like Paris over other cities, right? So you have a bias for Paris, right? That doesn't mean that you hate Rome, right? Or London, but it's going to shape how you view those cities, because you're going to be measuring it against your bias for the city that you prefer. Yep. So I think cognitive biases are the most fascinating area to start conversations, because they lead into something called social biases, that I call social biases, which is when bias is used in the context of gender or racial bias or cultural bias or bias related to age or orientation or identification, right? Like that type of bias, I think, is best measured in behaviors, not necessarily thoughts, because we all think stupid stuff sometimes. Like our brains are infallible, and I think that when you are really trying to deepen your understanding of social biases, you need to examine the behaviors. And then it's those behaviors over time is how bias becomes institutionalized. And so historical examples are slavery or patriarchy. I mean, those are institutionalized bias where the behaviors have become fortified into law, right? And in the workplaces, it gets into policies. It gets all the way down into, processes and meeting protocols, right? That's how bias becomes institutionalized within the workplace. And once bias is institutionalized, then it starts to shape the thoughts, right, of the incoming people or the people in that context. And so I refer that whole conceptual model as the bias ecosystem. And so, I hope that gives you a very thorough, long-winded explanation as to how I view biases.
I think it's a great way to put it together, indeed. And one of the things it made me think about when you were talking about it is very often we associate biases to something is quite negative, but then I often hear as well people saying, but some biases can be good. What are your thoughts about that?
Again, this is why it's critical to be precise with your language, right? Our brains are infallible, and we often take for granted that language means what you think it does. But you speak more than one language. You know that that's inherently wrong, right? Like language is
Mhm.
very, very, very tricky. And so I think with bias, it's a really useful linguistic construct because it's provocative enough. I think it's associated enough with negativity that
Mhm.
it captures your attention. Like there's something inherently like, oh, bias, like I'm intrigued. But it's also used in a positive context. You can have a bias of Paris over London, or chocolate over ice cream, or
Mhm.
it's not something that's just implicitly evil or wrong,
Mhm.
or and it doesn't have necessarily legal complications, right? When you start
Yeah.
talking about prejudice, which is also a preference, prejudice leads to discrimination.
Mhm.
These terms have legal complications. Much harder to have an authentic, open dialogue if you're framing behaviors and characterizing them in those terms.
Mhm. It makes sense completely. And so the a lot of the work you do is with organizations. And why is it important for these organizations to kind of tackle these biases in the workplace? And you talked about the three different kinds around the bias ecosystem. I imagine you do some work on each of them as well with any organization you work with.
Yeah, yeah. Because biases are part of human nature, right? Like this says here, if you have a brain, you have bias,
Mhm.
right? And so their biases are impacting every business that's utilizing brains, right?
Yep.
Which is every business on the planet. So I think what's unique about bias, and I want to refer back to your previous question for a moment, just to tie this thread together, is that I would actually argue that when a company is really small, let's just say 5 to 10 people, right? It's the startup
Mhm.
getting off the ground. I would say a particular type of bias, like me bias, is actually a strength for that organization. Because if you look at the way businesses organically grow, it's because you have like-minded people, and often they look the same, right? They at minimum have a shared set of values and shared perspectives, and a high degree of trust.
Mhm.
And those characteristics are critical when you're getting a business off the ground. And so the problem lies in that over time, if you over rely on that same bias and allow that to guide your decision making,
Mhm.
then you end up with a homogenous workforce, right? Then
Yep.
you end up on missing out on growth opportunities. Then you end up on missing out on market sector. And there's volumes of research that show diverse organizations outperform homogenous
Mhm.
organizations. And it's not a question of if that bias is going to end up having a negative effect. It's just a question of when.
Mhm. I understand. And so one of the things you said that was very interesting, I think it relates as well to the if you have a brain, you have a bias. You talked about, well, organizations that work with brains. That means that ultimately the work we're doing around creating a more diverse and a less biased organization actually is a work that is being done at an individual level.
Mm-hmm.
How suddenly do you so in the work you're doing, how do you support the people in the organization to have less of these biases, and I would imagine less of these what we would put probably in the bucket of kind of negative biases, or the biases that maybe hinder their growth or their development or whatever it might be behind that? How do you make that work happen?
Oh, well, I think, one approach is to start with individuals, and make them, not only more aware of their own cognitive biases, right? The
Mm-hmm.
biases that are just helping them in some contexts make better decisions and then hindering them in other contexts towards making better decisions.
Yep.
That's usually where this work starts. But it can't end there. And I think with your question about just biases, it's that's almost an impossible task to take on without being more precise about what type of bias you're talking about.
Okay.
If you have, an organization of, let's say, 100 people, and 80 of them are all white men, right? There's probably some gender bias that's in play. And that could stem from a like me bias, or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe it's a woman-led organization and it's just all women, and they've now grown, so it's now 80, and they maybe have 10% men, right? Or the question then becomes, how long can you sustain that bias? Because eventually it's going to be counterproductive.
So as an organization, then where do I start if I want to kind of tackle these biases in the workplace? What's the best place to start?
There's a number of different starting points. I think it's I can't name a universal, because it really depends on what the organization, where they're at, right? Is it a small company? Is it a large company? Are they having retention issues? Are they having, is the company growing? Is it growing by hiring brand new people? Is it growing through acquisitions? Like there's so many variables that come into play that will determine where the conversation starts. So I don't know that there's a universal starting point. With most of my clients that are for-profit organizations of varying sizes, I can put them into two buckets. One is they're very proactive. And I think those tend to be companies that are overall younger, companies that are in the tech sector. There's some consistent themes, I think, in the proactive companies. They hear bias and they don't fear it. They think, oh, I need to make sure I understand this, because it's if I don't understand it, it becomes a real and present danger. And so those clients, they're proactive, they're wonderful. We have a lot of different starting points. We could start with cognitive biases. Sometimes they want to go right in and do a deeper dive around, age bias, right? Or cultural bias, or, one of the other types of bias that they already see has potential for negatively impacting them. Then I have, this is a gross overgeneralization, but the other side of that coin is the reactive clients. And so these tend to be larger companies. These tend to be companies that have, that are more rooted in, more traditional business models. These are companies that, may have had a very established status quo within their culture that's sort of grounded in, a white male archetype, right? Like everything is sort of on a corporate standard of these are just how we behave. This is who we are. And everybody else has to assimilate into that mix some way, shape, or form. And those companies are experiencing a lot of problems. Like there's a lot of, reactive measures that are in place, right? Like they have people that are leaving, they have retention issues, they have sometimes issues have escalated to where there's workplace investigations that are taking place. And those clients I work with equally well, just obviously from a very different starting point.
Yeah. And so when one of the programs I think that you're running, if I'm right on the name, is called From Bias to Belonging. How do you create that bridge between the work you're doing around biases to bring that belonging in the organization, for the individuals, I imagine, as well?
Well, I think in an American context, and I know you are currently in Romania.
Yes, exactly.
And I'm currently in the United States and in California. I think in an American context, and I assume it's somewhat true to a greater or lesser degree in a European context. There's a, there was a very intentional, explicit effort that started, let's just call it 25, 30, maybe 40 years ago, right? To a lesser degree, of diversifying the workforce. I distinctly remember corporate America saying diversity, we need to tolerate diversity. That's the initial language that was used. And at the time that was groundbreaking, right? But when you think about it and step back and look at it through a different lens, especially today, you tolerate a rash, right? Like you tolerate something you want to go away. It was not really groundbreaking. I mean, it was groundbreaking for the time because there was no focus on diversity, no attention given to diversity, but diversity was to be tolerated. And that, didn't it last very long until, the same sort of public corporate consciousness said we need to have more inclusive environments. We can't, we hire people of color and then they don't stick around. Why is that? Well, you have a culture that's not really inclusive of people of color. Yep. And so there was the extension of diversity and inclusion, D&I. And, if you play that out over a period of time, you also then started getting into questions of equity, right? If you really are going to be inclusive of different types of people, well, we need some different structures in place that are going to allow people to really participate in a more meaningful way inside of this organization. So now you have diversity, equity, inclusion. DEI has now taken on there are DEI committees, there's DEI officers within certain organizations. There's, this area has really ballooned. I mean, it's grown to now. It's not uncommon, especially on the West Coast, with that proactive type of company, to say we want to create a culture of belonging. So you have DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And my program, starts with bias, so you can deepen your understanding of what the more pernicious biased processes are within an organization. Like how are these things contributing to a culture that's being, more exclusionary than it is inclusionary, and using bias as both a linguistic and conceptual framework, we can move conversations from bias to fostering a greater sense of belonging, to allow people to see themselves in the context of their work. Because that's one of the unconscious needs that I think the modern workplace is performing for everybody, right? You belong to this organization, right? Like you sign up, you are committing to work within that organization, but we don't think of it in those kind of psychological terms.
No, that's very true indeed, and I can definitely add up that this is something that is coming up. Okay, maybe not as fast as in the US, but in Europe, it's coming up, and I think we're going to find similar challenges and struggles as well in that journey. Maybe a little bit behind at the moment, but moving much faster, I think, than we think it is actually. And so if I come back to a little bit about the beginning of that work in creating that kind of that structure, where I love how you phrased it with the kind of the creating that space where people can have those conversations. one of the things I always like to think about is myself and how can I become a more inclusive person, but as well create a better sense of belonging around me. If I go back to the essence of biases, which often we talk about unconscious biases, how can I do some work to kind of overcome some of these biases that actually maybe hinder me in terms of creating that inclusivity and that belonging?
Well,
So at an individual level, I think, because being unconscious, I think the struggle I have is to think, how do I ever know whether I'm getting better or not?
yeah, that's a great question. And there's a lot going on with the first part, and then I think there's also a lot going on with the second part of that question. The first part, it's it's one thing to become aware of an unconscious bias, but the problem with unconscious biases is that when they're impacting you and those around you, you may not be aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's part of the reason why, as an individual, you can't you can't just rely on yourself, because we're limited in our own capacity. We're limited in our own conscious perceptions of the world, and yet we forget that, and we're all guilty of falling into that mental trap of, this is it, like, I'm focused on my job, this is what's important to me, I need to get this done. And we forget that we're now subject to all of these unconscious biases that may lead to, at minimum, miscommunication, and at worst, traumatizing somebody. And so I think the more that you can foster a sense of psychological safety within your immediate people that you're interacting with the most on every given day, right? So that when somebody does say, hey, Julian, I think you may have been a little biased in your thinking there in this meeting, your first reaction isn't defensiveness and to try to deny it. Your first reaction is, oh, wow, okay, this is an opportunity for me to become a better human being, or just make a better decision the next time around, right? So I think it's those are indicators of how bias can lead people to making better decisions, for strengthening your relationship, right? Instead of getting defensive and hating this person for calling that out, right? You can then reframe it and feel like they've just called you in. Like, now you're closer to that person. You have a stronger relationship with that person. It's rooted even more in trust, because you were open to being vulnerable, right? Like, you made a mistake, and now you can have an opportunity to, think differently next time, or do something different next time.
It's very interesting how you're phrasing it, because I think this is why it makes it so hard, I think, for people to face some of these struggles, because you talked about vulnerability, you talked about psychological safety, and it's quite a heavy thing when you think about it, actually, to put in place and to put yourself into. But I think what I hear as well is, I think the reward behind is way greater than kind of the pain of going through that process of being vulnerable and being maybe sometimes a little bit, I want to use the almost like that, a slightly negative connotation word, weak, because I think that's how it's seen. Unfortunately, being vulnerable often is associated to being weak. But I think, yeah, the way you're phrasing it, where it brings that reward that is pushing you way beyond where you started, I think makes the huge difference, and the reason why it's an important thing to get into it.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, again, this is probably not probably, this is an oversimplification, but in our brains, when we're using our executive functioning, we can be vulnerable. If it's an intellectual exercise, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's easy. But the problem begins when it's the origins of that are from more of our primal brain, right? If it's an instinctual reaction that you're having, often that overrides our executive functioning.
Mm-hmm.
And now our executive functioning is just simply justifying the initial feeling that was stemming from that instinctual reaction. And I think a working theory is that our brains are still evolving, right? We're not there yet. We're still wired for fight and flight. We're still wired for a primary physical experience in the world, and in a communal, experience in the world when it comes to other people. And we live in a world where it's those instincts. I think we may over rely on them in many cases, and yeah. So it's not a blanket statement. It's far more nuanced than that. But I think, we need to continue evaluating the origins of where these impulses are coming from.
I know we're coming close to the time we're spending together, but I want to ask you a very personal question. What's the most difficult bias that you had to overcome?
Oh God, my own internalized sense of whiteness. It reared its head when my children were in school, probably like second or third grade, when my oldest, was in second or third grade. And he was being categorized by the principal as a student of color. So my wife, I jokingly described her as, she represents as black as I am white, but it's so much more nuanced than that. My wife actually identifies as Latina. Her first language is Spanish. She originates from Bolivia in South America, and she's Afro-Bolivian. So there's a lot of nuance and layers there in her identity. And, I'm Midwestern, American, white, cisgender, male, and our children are a product of that, right? Like, so they have their own sense of identity in the world now. But, the first time that my children were being cast into this student of color mode, I had this visceral reaction. Like, I feared on their behalf. Like, oh my gosh, they're going to be treated less than because they're not being perceived as a white student. And that was probably one of the hardest moments for me to even accept that, like, this is the origins of that, is like this internalized sense of whiteness, that white is really the baseline of where I'm, where this is coming from. So I think, there's a lot of institutionalized biases that favor white. And I think it's true not just in the United States. I think it's true all over the planet, where there's evidence that lighter complexions get more favorable treatment. They're viewed as more beautiful, and there's preferential treatment that's given based on a lighter complexion. and I'm on a mission to disrupt that. Like, I don't want to be unconsciously influenced by that, even though I think to to a degree we all are.
Thank you for sharing that. And it was a very interesting point of view, and I can totally relate with that as well. I should not say relate, actually, because I'm not in the same situation, but it made me think and ponder on it, and I will continue that process, actually, because it's a very interesting way to think about it. And I've never thought about how do I kind of look at that bias myself. So thank you very much for sharing that.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it can easily be extended to a cultural bias, right? Like there's rampant stereotypes about French feeling like they're superior to everybody around them, right? So like, it's not whiteness in that case per se. Maybe there's some, if you get farther into the conversation, there might be some complexion preferences. But I think a similar dynamic plays out with cultures and with countries and with people overvaluing how they identify. I think that's going back to like me bias. That's just a manifestation of it.
Definitely do not go and say anything bad about French food to a French person. You're going to have a bad time, that's for sure. And there is definitely probably a bias behind that.
Absolutely.
And I'm guilty of it, that's for sure. I'm very, very proud of my cuisine, for sure. So one of the things, and I want to and myself and the listeners to understand a little bit more how you do that, to finish up as well. You mentioned about that mission to disrupt that. How do you make that happen? How do you create that mission, and how can people actually get in touch with you if they want to learn more about that disruption that you've started?
Well, I think an easy way, if the way that I described bias and the bias ecosystem and cognitive biases versus social biases versus institutionalized biases, if that conceptual model resonates with you, then you can go to my website and take a very simple bias assessment, right? It's the first thing you'll see on the website. And it takes like 4 to 6 minutes to answer some questions, but then it gives you a breakdown of where you're at with your responses and how likely you are to be impacted by one or more of those cognitive biases. I narrowed the research down to 5 that I think are most common in every workplace, but that can be extended out to your day-to-day activities. Yep. So I think there's a practical measure in that. It's it's intriguing. It's always I think intriguing to learn more about how your brain is operating, and that may be a basis for wanting to learn more.
Definitely, I actually did it myself, and it was very interesting to look at the results. I will continue the work. I will continue the work on that. Great.
Well, good. And come join us for the Inclusive Leadership in a Virtual World. I know you are, Julian, you're also joining that on Wednesdays at 10 o'clock Pacific time. So there's a gratuitous plug for that. That's also on my company website, percipiocompany.com. And those are 2 very easy ways to start this lifetime journey of discovery.
And I was going to say, actually, I was going to mention about the weekly meeting. I think it's a great place. And just before we started the podcast, we were talking about it a little bit as well. And there are some wonderful people. You have a guest speaker every week as well, who talks about various topics around inclusive leadership. And I think it is indeed a great place to be for networking with people who have similar struggles, who have also similar maybe stories or completely different struggles and completely different stories, but that we can learn from as well. So it's definitely a great place. And I'll put all the links in the episode notes as well for people to be able to reach out.
Oh, beautiful. And thank you for doing what you're doing, Julian. This is, to approach diversity, with this model of being two peas in a pod, I think is a great way to do it, because, we do have far more in common with one another than we do have different. I think because of our cognitive limitations, we intend to over accentuate the differences.
No, very true. And thank you very much as well for being part of this journey. I hope we'll have you again, maybe on another topic or deep dive on some of these. So thank you so much for being here with me today.
Bring it on. It's great to speak with you.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. We'd love to hear from you. To catch all the latest from us, you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube at As Diverse as Two Peas in a Pod. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.